And I'd like to welcome to the stage Sumana Rajaratnam, who is our Senior Analyst for Custom Solutions. Rajam, would you like, Sumana, would you like to come up, please? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charlie, for the introduction. Good morning, my name is Sumana, as Charlie just said, and I'm from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and I'm also from Singapore, so obviously very glad to see Singapore on that list. But the one thing, when I looked at that list, going through those batch of new cities added, is the diversity in those cities, right? Where they are located, some coastal, some river-based cities, some that are landlocked, the type of problems that they face. It's a very diverse set of cities that we're looking at, which that diversity also means diverse sets of solutions, diverse sets of challenges. I want to start by thanking the Rockefeller Foundation again for their support in doing this Pulse survey. They were very engaged partners from the start and all along the way in the process. It's just before the tea break, so I hope you have some resilience to hunger. But the aim of this survey was to examine the role of business in building urban climate resilience. And before I start, why, I think it's useful just to repeat a bit about why urban areas, and I can offer three very quick causes. One is that urban areas are growing very rapidly. Cities in East Asia alone absorb 2 million new urban residents each month and are projected to triple their built-up areas in the next 2 decades. Cities in Southeast Asia, of which 2 are in the new batch, Singapore and Phnom Penh, are expanding at rates 5 times faster than in OECD countries. Cities are also very special places because they have an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, they are vulnerable. According to the Asian Development Bank, 15 of the world's 20 megacities are vulnerable to climate change impacts, such as flooding and coastal surges. The coastal cities of Kolkata, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and the riverside cities of Delhi, Tokyo, and Kuala Lumpur are extremely sensitive to both sea and river level rise-related hazards. Globally, the projected number of people exposed to tropical cyclones and earthquakes in large cities is expected to double by 2050. Besides where these cities are located, other factors are important when considering a city's resilience. Factors such as the size of their populations, their infrastructure, the pressure to provide urban services such as housing, health services, jobs and employment, all compound and interact to affect the vulnerability of cities. So on the one hand, they are vulnerable, but on the other hand, cities are also centers of knowledge. They are centers of finance, centers of institutional power, centers of consumer demand, centers of innovation, and they have influence to build their resilience. These include changes to institutions, infrastructure, and urban services, all things that I think the 100 Resilient Cities program is striving to achieve. So that's one interesting fact about cities, is this relationship between their vulnerability and their ability to affect their own resilience. I'll spend about 15 minutes taking you through this survey, starting with who the respondents are, and then looking at different views of business and how they are preparing and responding to climate change, who they think should be responsible, and what some of the differences are between respondents who are based in Asia and the rest of the world. To see that this works, very good. So who answered the survey? There were 250 respondents, over half of which were from organizations that were based in Asia or had significant operations in Asia. It was a very senior level survey, so 85% of the respondents had C-suite titles. Companies with annual revenues of 500 million or less were about half, 500 million to 10 billion, about 40%, and then the rest were companies with revenues of 10 billion or more. Where did they come from? Western Europe was 30%, Asia Pacific 28%, North America 25%, and then the rest from Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. what did we start with? We started by asking respondents what the biggest threats to business were, and then went down into other more climate change focused questions. As major investors in cities, the private sector needs to protect its urban assets. So it's not surprising that today self-interest drives corporate investments. When we ask executives what they are thinking about other pressures first before they look at climate change. They rank pressure on things like urban infrastructure from overcrowding. They look at things like civil unrest and political instability. And those are the biggest threats to their business. And after that comes climate change concerns. Moreover, among the regions, Asia-based executives are more worried about issues such as rapid urbanization and the pressure this puts on infrastructure. And that's no surprise given the pace of urbanization in Asia. One study by the World Bank estimates that governments of developing countries in Asia have to build the public infrastructure on average for a city of 1 million new residents each week for the next 40 years. So that illustrates the pace of urbanization in Asia. When we asked respondents specifically about what the risks for their markets were, notably things like increased climate risks such as severe storms, rising temperatures, floods, and cyclones do not top the list. In fact, of 9 challenges that we put forward to them, these issues ranked 5th, trailing things like unrest, political instability, rising crime and corruption, and growing divide in income inequality in urban areas. These suggest when it comes to markets, there is a sharper private sector focus on non-climate change linked urban issues. But climate change threats do preoccupy executives when they're thinking about their supply chains. In fact, those threats, when they're thinking about supply chains, rank 2nd in the list of those 9 challenges, just below the risks posed by increased pressure on urban infrastructure. This suggests that companies have seen disruptions that have happened recently to supply chains, things like the 2011 floods or the devastation of Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey, and are taking note. They are more wary of the whole ecosystem of their supply chain. There was also an interesting difference in respondents who are based in Asia about their supply chains, who are less worried about pressure on urban infrastructure and the impact of climate change, and significantly more worried about the rising urban wealth-poverty divide. We also asked executives to consider the risks that climate change poses to their markets, supply chains, and operations. When it comes to climate change, worries over business disruption weigh very heavily. Globally, altogether, all these respondents pointed to the energy supply, the breakdown of transport and communication systems as their top climate change-related concerns for their markets and for their operations. Similarly, the possibility of transport and communications disruptions, the threat to physical infrastructure, or the loss of energy supplies are the main supply chain-related concerns among executives. However, the top worry for supply chain-related concerns is a threat of business disruption, not only to their own operations, but to the operations of their suppliers. They realize that if you do have weak links, it can affect your whole business and your whole supply chains. Here in this slide, we asked respondents, what was the biggest threat to the cities? So if you remember over the past 2 slides, we were asking the question more about how is one's company affected, but this question relates directly to the cities. And these observations, by and large, dovetail with respondent perceptions of the biggest threats to their operations and markets from climate change. They all are very worried about the breakdown of essential services. They are looking at disruptions to energy and water supplies, transport and communications, and the damage to physical infrastructure. So very much they see cities as they see their own businesses, and I think that's quite an interesting finding when it comes to climate change-linked concerns. We also asked the respondents what are the benefits of adapting to climate change and having some resilience. Looking ahead, I think it's quite encouraging that very few dispute the benefits of investing in climate change resilience. Just 10% see no benefit in such investments. And that's why respondents ranked the top climate change resilience benefits as increased competitiveness, cost savings, increased productivity, and efficiency gains. Improved health was also selected by nearly half of the respondents as a top benefit. I think that the sense was that in the past, many of these companies would have done this for reasons that Donald was saying about CSR 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, just as a means of burnishing their reputations. But this Pulse survey showed that this may be examples of the resilience dividend, the concept that Judith Rodin has introduced, examples of proactive, indirect consequences of larger developmental efforts and larger economic benefits that will increase the city's resilience, not only focusing on disasters, but other types of disruptions. Notably, 90% of the respondents believed there were benefits to building climate change resilience, a sentiment that was more widely shared in Asia. So 96% of respondents in Asia believed in building climate change resilience, compared to North America, where the figure was about 80%. We also had to ask them, who's responsible for climate change resilience? By and large, businesses believe that it is the purview of the government to be responsible for this. This applies to things that municipal authorities are responsible for, things like sanitation systems, the loss of energy supplies and water, damage to physical infrastructure. But businesses did not only view all responsibility as residing with the government. They also, in the task of maintaining transport and communication systems, companies perceive a shared responsibility with government. So there are already areas where businesses think they should be sharing the responsibility. Businesses see the importance of keeping their own businesses running. That's no surprise. But nearly 2/3 of the respondents said that their primary role in fortifying their urban areas includes investing in things like backup power supply, using more renewable energy, and training staff. So also an interesting relationship here between some things that are immediate in terms of responding to a disaster, like backup power supplies, but also looking at things a bit longer term in terms of using renewable energy or training their staff. We asked what factors would best strengthen cities' ability to prepare and adapt to climate change. And again here, the responsibility, I think, in the view of business, was on policymakers. So businesses thought that policymakers play the bigger role in preparing cities for climate change. More than half of the respondents point to the importance of a powerful leader, such as a mayor, in strengthening a city's ability to prepare, coordinate all different types of government departments as well. So powerful leaders came out as very important. The government is viewed as a facilitator of urban climate change resilience building, particularly through certain types of regulatory incentives. And the businesses thought that regulatory incentives such as land use, zoning, or building codes were the most important things that city officials and policymakers could respond to. We also asked about the respondents, about their thoughts about some of these factors 5 years ago, now, and 5 years from now. So trying to track how these perceptions might have shifted over time and are going to shift over time. Despite the belief, as I mentioned in the previous slides, that it's the responsibility of government, 90% acknowledge the role of business in resilience building, and almost all respondents in Asia acknowledge the role of business. So this near universal recognition of business as a contributor to climate change resilience building in the region suggests a shift in sentiment from focusing primarily on their own operations. The top climate change actions will involve more collaboration with government, civil society, customers, and suppliers. So businesses also believe that it's a diverse set of stakeholders that they need to work with in order to build climate change resilience. More executives plan to form partnerships in 5 years, 5 years from now than was the case 5 years ago. This marks a shift from the current focus of shoring up one's own operations. A few differences with respondents in Asia here as well. They feel much more strongly about the business sector's role in building climate change resilience. And what they focus on is encouraging customers and clients to engage in resilience programs as the primary role of private sector in preparing cities. A larger percentage of this group of respondents in Asia also said that they have been implementing programs already, so implementing programs in the past, and that they'll continue to do so in the future compared to the global group of respondents. We asked about some of the benefits, so we had to also ask about some of the obstacles to building resilience. Cost is by far the biggest obstacle to building urban climate change resilience, selected by nearly half of the respondents as the primary barrier to boosting resilience. The other two factors that came in were skepticism about climate change and limited buy-in from the community as other kind of top obstacles there. This, I think, is another interesting point, is that respondents from Asia were less worried about limited buy-in from the community than their global peers and attach much more importance to the lack of a compelling business case. And perhaps that's something that we can discuss at the end of the presentation. And so just 2 or 3 final slides now to summarize some of the findings from the survey. Companies now consider urban risks that lie beyond the immediate effects of climate change. So they worry most about pressure on urban infrastructure, from overcrowding, about civil unrest, about political instability, and growing income inequality. And then after those 4 concerns comes climate change. And they're looking at it from this purview of a much more holistic view. They're looking at it from the view of increasing their competitiveness, increasing employee health outcomes, greater productivity, lower absenteeism, and cost savings. And these are the primary drivers for corporate investments in climate resilience. The private sector still sees the government as shouldering the lion's share of the burden, but as I mentioned, that is changing as more and more executives look to their own role in building resilience. There's a lot more desire to seek partnerships with government and civil society to expand participation. And this anticipation of a new collaborative era, I think, is one of the other key findings from the survey. It's a break from the past of just focusing on their own resilience into a more collaborative form of partnerships. What were some of the difference between the respondents globally and the respondents in Asia? Asia-based executives were more concerned than their peers about the risk of increased climate change, civil unrest, and political instability. Respondents in Asia also least worried about terrorist attacks and a rising urban wealth poverty divide. And Asia is perceived as much less well prepared for climate change than the rest of the world. Respondents in Asia appear to feel more strongly than their global peers about the business sector's role in Asia, in general, in building climate change resilience. And a larger portion of respondents in Asia have already been engaging with governments. The other key finding, I think, was that Asia businesses have been historically more willing to form partnerships with city authorities and establish cross-sectorial climate change alliances than their global peers. And so I think we have a bit more time now for questions, but what I want to leave you with is some of the write-in responses from the respondents to spark some conversation, and also perhaps with a question or two. The first being, what do you think of the differences in Asia compared to the global group, especially with regards to this increased concern about climate change in Asia, but less of a desire to get community buy-in and community involvement? And second thing is, what other things should businesses be considering? What can they take the lead in? Should it be in things like decentralization or innovation? Should it be in things like public-private partnerships, those types of things that will allow more infrastructure building, and other things that we've missed so far in talking about things today. For example, should we be looking at things from a gender perspective? Just one stat to leave you with: during the Asian tsunami of 2004, for every one man that was killed, 4 women were killed. And so, is a gender perspective important as well when you're building resilience in urban areas? And so we have some time for questions, and I'll end there. So if anybody has questions from the audience. Yes, 2 questions over here.
Thank you. Very helpful, very informative. My name is Bernard Dole from Cities Development Initiative for Asia. We work in Asia with 94 cities. On demand, they ask us for support, and we bring their infrastructure plans to finance. And I would have expected one result, especially out of the market point of view, that what we feel is one thing: additional quality brought to infrastructure plans might considered by banks, and that's what we hear, to reduce operational and macro risks. It makes it more attractive for banks to finance urban infrastructure if they feel climate change issues are tackled, environmental issues, even poverty reduction or inclusiveness is added to the infrastructure plans. All that reduces risk and makes it more attractive. And we need private sector investment in urban infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I think that one thing that the Pulse survey perhaps didn't look at deeply was this role of finance. But as we've heard from several of the speakers today already, I think that the financial architecture of a city, the financial strength of its citizens, is certainly very important in terms of building overall resilience, whether it's from the point of view of being able to invest in the city, or it's the point of view from individual citizens having access to bank accounts and an ability to save and insurance products and that type of thing. So I think that your comment is very well received. We had one here, and then after that, over there as well.
Hi, my name's Mike DiGregorio. I'm from the Asia Foundation, country representative in Vietnam. The Asia Foundation's office in Vietnam has been working on public-private partnerships in climate change and disaster risk management for about 5 years now. And from our own surveys, we have very similar kinds of responses. And one of the things that becomes very clear is that businesses tend to focus on immediate disasters and climate-related risks. And I just find this very interesting that they don't get the kind of second derivative risks related in particular to business. For example, whether the future will be much more businesses will be much more regionally organized than globally organized, supply chains smaller rather than greater because of higher transportation costs, for example. Or whether industries like the tourism industry will go through the kind of same changes. So I'm just asking now if you have any reflection on that from this survey, that is, are businesses that you surveyed much more focused on the particular climate-related issues rather than the larger kind of business implications of climate change?
So from this survey, I think that what came out is that there is a difference for executives when they're considering their supply chains. So they're very cognizant of perhaps weak links in supply chains. And so their concerns when they're just thinking about their supply chains are perhaps different than when they're thinking about their operations and their markets. So there is a bit of difference between those two fields. In terms of their specific concerns, even when they're thinking about supply chains, they are still thinking about other issues like pressure on urban infrastructure, like civil unrest and political instability, and they prioritize that ahead of climate change-linked concerns. But still, whether you are in supply chains or you're thinking about operations or you're thinking about markets, all of them, I think, do agree that there needs to be more partnerships between businesses and different stakeholders, whether it's the government or civil society, in things like forming PPPs, for example, and financing these types of issues. Yes, one question over there, I believe, and then I think we have time for, maybe just one.
Thank you. My name is Kutoro Magusubrodo. Until 1 month ago, I was the minister and head of the President Delivery Unit for the past 5 years. And one of my tasks was to chairing the Indonesian National Task Force on REDD+, as part of the climate change. But before that, between 2005 and 2009, I was the director of the tsunami reconstruction program in Aceh. I'm focusing now on the climate change. There are so many speakers addressing this climate change. And I'd like to mention that Indonesia declared to take part actively in fighting climate change in 2008, and not only taking part, but also pledge that by the year 2020, we are going to reduce emission by 26% and an additional 15% with the help of the international community. My point is that although our leader in Indonesia declared that Indonesia will take part actively on fighting climate change, and especially we are now the first country to have a national agency on REDD+, but when it comes to the awareness of climate change in the society, is very limited. So this is something that is really striking. All the leaders talk about climate change. All the leaders pretend to understand what is REDD+. But when it comes to the public, the society, they don't know at all about what is climate change. Because climate change is there in North America and Europe. Nothing to do with us. And if you try to relate forest deforestation and climate change, then the discussion stops. They don't understand how's the relation between deforestation and climate change. One thing that has never been mentioned up to now is the role of politician and parliamentarian. This is something that is really important. We tried very hard to make them in Indonesia to understand about climate change, about REDD+, and it's tough. Especially when it comes to parliamentarian, and try to convince them, try to educate them, quote unquote. Politician does not like to be educated. And we almost fail. The good thing is that we have a new parliament 2 months ago. Now we have to deal with the new parliamentarian. And it's so surprising that this is the first time since 2008 that we succeed to educate this parliamentarian what is climate change and what is REDD+. And these are the people who actually should issue all the policies, laws, bills, and the understanding about this is just very limited. So I believe that's one thing that's really important for all of us, to raise the awareness of the politician, for them to understand. Because if they don't understand about this, then climate change is just an abstract thing that should not be followed by any policies. So this is my remark on the first session of this one-day seminar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. I thought it was a very, very good comment. Certainly, I'll just wrap up very quickly, but certainly from the perspective of the survey, we looked at businesses and skepticism was one of the obstacles. Next year is a very important year as well, as does the Hyogo Framework for Action review. There's also the review of Millennium Development Goals, and these are all forums where we can raise awareness not only amongst businesses but amongst politicians as well. I'd like now to hand over to Ashwin, who's going to say a few words. Thank you very much.